Looks like your objections have been approved.
The morning it happened, I was drinking my coffee on the back porch, watching the birds move through the yard like nothing in the world was wrong. It was a Tuesday, early spring, the kind of quiet morning where you almost forget that anything could go sideways. Then I heard the rumble. It started low, like a distant engine idling somewhere down the street. I didn't think much of it at first. Construction was common enough in the neighborhood. People were always adding decks, extending driveways, doing something or another to their properties. But the sound got louder, closer, and then it stopped, right in front of my house. I set my coffee down and walked around to the front yard. There was a large flatbed truck parked at the curb. On the back of it sat a piece of equipment I recognized immediately, a compact skid steer loader, the kind used for demolition work and excavation. Standing beside the truck were two workers in high-visibility vests. And standing in my driveway, arms folded, wearing a lanyard with a laminated badge swinging from her neck, was Patricia Holden, the president of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association. She had a clipboard. She had a folder. She had that particular expression that people wear when they believe, deeply, completely, that they are in the right and you are not. Behind her, pulling up to the curb in a patrol car, was an officer from the county sheriff's department. I stood there on my porch steps, still in my house shoes, trying to understand what I was looking at. A demolition crew, my HOA president, a sheriff's deputy, all standing in front of my property at 8:15 in the morning. Over a fence. Not a dangerous fence. Not an illegal fence. My fence. The one I had built on my own property, with permits, with a licensed contractor, on the correct side of the property line. My fence. And somehow, this woman had convinced herself, and apparently a demolition crew, that she had the authority to tear it down. She hadn't knocked on my door. She hadn't called. She had simply arrived with a machine and people in vests and expected that to be enough. What Patricia Holden didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 3 days earlier, while cleaning out some old boxes in my garage, I had found a document. A piece of paper I had almost thrown away without reading. A document that, as it turned out, was going to change everything about the way this morning ended. I'm going to tell you exactly how this played out. All of it. From the very beginning. Because the truth is, the fence was never really the issue. The fence was just the latest move in a game Patricia had been playing for almost 2 years. And on this particular Tuesday morning, the game was finally, permanently, over. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because the context here matters a lot. My name is Marcus Webb, and I bought my home in Maplewood Ridge about 4 years before any of this happened. It's a single-family home in a mid-sized suburb in the Midwest, the kind of neighborhood that looks quiet and friendly from the outside, and mostly is, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. The house sits on a corner lot, which means I have more yard than most of my neighbors. A little more than 1/3 of an acre. Good soil. Mature trees on the east side. A 2-car driveway, an attached garage, and a backyard that I've spent a lot of time and care turning into something I'm genuinely proud of. When I bought the property, I did everything you're supposed to do. Full title search. A land survey. I have the plat map, the deed, and the official survey on file, and I know exactly where my property lines sit. I didn't cut corners. I'd been burned before on a rental situation years ago where boundary disputes cost me money and headaches, and I swore I'd never walk into a property again without knowing precisely what I owned. So I didn't. Maplewood Ridge does have an HOA. I knew that going in. Truthfully, it wasn't a deal breaker for me. The neighborhood was well maintained, the dues were reasonable, and at the time the association was run by a fairly laid-back board of volunteers who seemed mostly interested in keeping the common areas clean and settling the occasional dispute about trash can placement. Minor stuff. Nothing that suggested what was coming. Then Patricia Holden got elected HOA president. That was about 2.5 years before the morning with the demolition crew. Patricia ran on a platform of raising standards and restoring community pride, which sounded fine in the abstract. In practice, it meant that she spent the first several months of her term driving slowly through the neighborhood in her silver SUV, taking photographs of people's properties, and mailing out violation notices with a frequency that genuinely alarmed some of my neighbors. People got notices for things like flower pot placement, the color of their garden hose, and whether their house numbers were the approved size. One neighbor told me he received 3 notices in a single month about his mailbox. I didn't receive anything at first. I kept my yard clean, my grass cut, my house in good repair. I figured if I just stayed out of Patricia's way, she'd leave me alone. But here's the thing about a corner lot. You're visible from 2 streets. And I had an older wooden privacy fence on the back and side portions of the property that had started to show its age. I'd been planning to replace it for a while, and after the first winter with Patricia in charge, I decided the time had come. I did everything right. I hired a licensed contractor. I pulled permits from the county, which, in our jurisdiction, is what the law actually requires. Not HOA pre-approval, but a county permit. I checked the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, and verified that fences were permitted, that the height of what I was building was within range, and that the materials were not on any prohibited list. I notified the HOA in writing as a courtesy. The fence went up in late summer, about a year and a half before the morning in question. It was a cedar wood fence, 6 feet tall on the back portion, stepping down to 4 feet along the side yard facing the secondary street. Clean, straight, well built. Several neighbors actually complimented it. Patricia did not compliment it. Within 2 weeks of the fence being completed, I received my first formal HOA violation notice. It said the fence was not approved by the Architectural Review Committee and needed to be removed. I wrote back, calmly, attaching copies of my county permit and referencing the specific sections of the CC&Rs that permitted fencing. I noted that the CC&Rs did not actually require ARC pre-approval for fencing, only for major structural additions to the dwelling, which a fence is not. Patricia wrote back and told me I was wrong. The violation notice stood, and that was how it started. For the first few weeks after that initial exchange, I tried to handle everything through written communication. I kept copies of every letter, every email, every notice. I've always believed that if you're going to be in a dispute with anyone, a neighbor, an institution, anyone, you keep a paper trail. It's not paranoia. It's just how you protect yourself. Patricia did not appreciate the paper trail. She preferred conversations. Specifically, she preferred showing up at the door. The first time she came to my house directly, it was on a Saturday afternoon in September, about 3 weeks after I'd sent my written response to the violation notice. I was in the garage, doing some work on my truck, when I heard the doorbell. I came around the side of the house and found Patricia standing on my porch in khaki slacks and a blue polo shirt with the Maplewood Ridge HOA logo embroidered on the chest. She was holding her clipboard, which I would come to think of as a permanent extension of her arm. She smiled when she saw me, but it was that tight, professional smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "Marcus," she said, "I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a few minutes?" I said I did, and I came up to the porch. I didn't invite her inside. Something about the situation told me to keep things in a visible, open space. She started by telling me she had reviewed my letter and appreciated that I'd taken the time to respond. The tone was pleasant, patronizing, and practiced. Then she pivoted to the substance. "The issue," she said, "is that the Architectural Committee has guidelines that aren't fully captured in the CC&Rs. We maintain a supplemental design guide, and your fence, the materials, and the height on the street-facing side doesn't align with those guidelines." I asked her to show me where in the governing documents it stated that a supplemental design guide carried enforceable authority. Because the CC&Rs, the actual legal governing documents of the association, were what I'd agreed to when I bought the property, not a separate document that I had never seen or been given. She said the design guide was on the HOA website. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I had gone through the HOA's website before building the fence and had not found any such document. I asked when it had been published. She glanced at her clipboard. "The board updates the guidelines periodically. When was the current version published?" I asked again. She moved on. She said the violation notice stood and that if I didn't bring the fence into compliance within 30 days, the association would begin assessing fines. The fine started at $75 per week. I asked her what into compliance meant, specifically. Did that mean tearing the fence down entirely? Modifying it? Painting it? She said the fence needed to be removed or substantially modified to match the design guide specifications. I asked again for a copy of the design guide in writing. She said she'd have someone email it to me. I thanked her, told her I would review whatever she sent, and asked her to please direct all further communications to me in writing. She didn't love that. Her expression shifted slightly, just for a moment, and I could see that this wasn't how she expected the conversation to go. Most people, when an authority figure shows up at the door with a clipboard and official-looking credentials, get a little rattled. They apologize. They start negotiating. They try to find a way to make the problem go away quickly. I wasn't rattled. I'd done my homework. Now, I want to ask you something directly, because I think about this moment a lot. If Patricia had shown up at your door like that, friendly on the surface, firm underneath, with a violation notice and vague references to rules you'd never seen, what would you have done? Would you have agreed to modify the fence just to end the conflict? Or would you have stood your ground and asked to see the actual rules? I'm genuinely curious, because I think the answer says something about how these situations tend to go. People who fold early tend to invite more pressure, not less. And people like Patricia tend to count on that. Over the next few days, I did receive an email from a board member with a PDF attached, the so-called Supplemental Design Guide. I read it carefully. It was a 12-page document, formatted like an official HOA addendum, full of language about aesthetic standards and architectural harmony. But at the top of page 1, in small print, it said this: "This document is advisory in nature and does not supersede the recorded CC&Rs or any applicable county regulations." Advisory in nature. Those 3 words would come up again later. I highlighted them. I printed the page. I put it in my folder. Before I get to what happened next, I want to ask you something. Patricia had just told me my fence was a violation, even though it was permitted by the county and consistent with the actual CC&Rs. She was citing a supplemental guide that she admitted, in her own document, was advisory only. If this were happening to you, how would you respond? Would you modify the fence, fight back, or try to find a middle ground? Drop your answer in the comments. I read them all, and you might be surprised how many people have been in almost this exact situation. The written design guide didn't slow Patricia down. If anything, the fact that I'd asked for documentation seemed to sharpen her focus on me. Whatever calculation she had made about my property, about me, had shifted from routine enforcement to something that felt more personal. Over the following 3 months, I received a total of 7 HOA violation notices. I kept them all in a folder that I labeled, plainly enough, HOA file. The first additional notice, sent about 2 weeks after our porch conversation, said that my driveway encroached on the HOA's common area. This was not true. I had the survey. My driveway ended exactly at my property line, as recorded. I wrote back with a copy of the survey and a precise measurement. The notice was rescinded without comment. The second notice said that my mailbox post was not the approved design and needed to be replaced within 14 days. I looked through the CC&Rs. There was no mention of mailbox post design anywhere. I wrote back saying so. No response. The notice simply stopped coming up. The third notice was about my tree. Specifically, about a large oak on the corner of my lot whose canopy extended slightly over the sidewalk. The notice said I was responsible for maintaining a clear pedestrian clearance of 8 feet from the ground beneath overhanging branches. Now, this one was actually reasonable. There are municipal codes about that. So I called a tree service, had the relevant branches trimmed, and sent Patricia a receipt. Done. But then came Notice 4. Notice 4 was different from all the others. It wasn't about aesthetics or minor code compliance. It was about the fence again, still, always, the fence, and this time it was written differently. More formally, it cited a specific section of the HOA's Articles of Incorporation and stated that the board had voted, at a closed session, to authorize physical remediation of the fence if I had not voluntarily removed it within 45 days. Physical remediation. I had to read that phrase several times. I contacted an attorney who handled HOA law to get a general sense of what my options were. I want to be clear that I'm not offering any legal advice here, because I'm not qualified to do that, and every situation is different. But what I learned in that consultation was that HOA boards have limited legal authority to enter a property and remove a structure without a court order, especially when that structure was built with a valid permit on indisputably private land. The attorney's general view was that the notice was almost certainly an empty threat designed to pressure me into compliance. I wrote back to the HOA board, not just to Patricia, but to all 5 board members, by certified mail, requesting a copy of the minutes from the closed session at which this vote had allegedly taken place. HOA boards in most states are required to maintain minutes of their meetings, including closed sessions where legal or financial matters are discussed, and members have the right to request those records. Patricia's response came back within a week. The minutes, she wrote, were confidential due to the legal nature of the discussion. I wrote back and noted that while certain attorney-client discussions can be protected, the existence of a vote and its outcome are generally not confidential, and I was entitled to know whether a vote had actually been taken. I asked again. No response. Then came notice 5. This one told me that my truck, my own vehicle, parked in my own driveway, was in violation of HOA rules regarding commercial vehicle parking. My truck had a small magnetic sign on the door for a side business I ran doing handyman work. Patricia had apparently decided that a magnetic sign made it a commercial vehicle. I removed the magnetic sign, not because I agreed with her interpretation, but because that particular battle wasn't worth fighting. Then notice 6 came. My outdoor lighting was not consistent with neighborhood character. I had a solar-powered lantern post near the front walkway. I'd bought it at a hardware store. Half the neighborhood had similar lights. And then notice 7, which arrived in late winter and stopped me cold. It stated that the HOA board had retained a contractor to inspect the fence for structural integrity, and that based on that inspection, which had apparently taken place without my knowledge or consent, and which I can only assume involved someone looking at my fence from the sidewalk, the fence was now being designated as a hazardous structure. This, the notice claimed, gave the association grounds for emergency removal under a provision in the CC&Rs dealing with dangerous conditions that posed a risk to the community. I went out and looked at my fence. It was a year old, built by a licensed contractor. It was perfectly sound. There were no loose boards, no leaning sections, no signs of damage from the winter weather. If that fence was a hazardous structure, then every fence in the neighborhood was a hazardous structure. I took photographs. 47 of them, from every angle. I noted the date and time on each one. I wrote another certified letter to the board. I'll be honest with you. By this point, I was feeling the weight of it. Not panicked, not ready to quit, but tired in a specific way, the kind of tired that comes not from hard work, but from sustained, low-level conflict. The kind where you start doing a quick mental check every morning just to see if anything new has arrived in your mailbox. I had done everything right. I had followed the rules, pulled the permits, communicated professionally, kept records. And Patricia was still pushing. She had escalated to threatening demolition. She had labeled a sound, permitted structure a hazard. And now she was apparently talking to contractors. What I didn't know was that she had already made a call she shouldn't have made. And it was about to bring things to a head faster than I expected. I want to pause here and ask you something. Because at this point, I'd received 7 violation notices in about 3 months. Some were fabricated, some were withdrawn without comment, and one had just labeled my brand new, permitted, professionally built fence a hazardous structure. Does this sound like genuine HOA enforcement to you? Or does this sound like something else entirely? Is this a power trip? An abuse of authority? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave your take in the comments below. After notice 7, something strange happened. Nothing. For almost 6 weeks, I heard nothing from the HOA. No notices. No visits. No certified letters. Patricia's silver SUV still drifted through the neighborhood on her regular patrol, and I'd see it slow as it passed my house, but nothing came of it. No clipboard on my porch. No emails. The silence should have been reassuring, and part of me did exhale a little. I started to wonder if she'd quietly dropped it. If maybe the board had pushed back internally, or if someone had pointed out to her that the paper trail she was creating was not flattering to her position. HOA boards, after all, have to answer to the community. They have annual meetings. Members can vote them out. The spring came on steady and warm. My yard looked good. The fence looked good. I fixed a small section of the front walkway, planted some new shrubs along the foundation, and generally tried to focus on the house rather than the conflict. My neighbor across the street, a man named Dale who'd lived in the neighborhood for almost 20 years, stopped me one afternoon while I was getting the mail. He said he'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia was still working on something regarding my fence, but that a couple of the other board members were getting uncomfortable with how far it had gone. He said one of them, he didn't know who, had apparently told Patricia at a recent board meeting that the association's approach wasn't sustainable and could expose them to liability. That was encouraging. Not definitive, but encouraging. I thanked Dale and filed it away. I also had a moment of what I can only call accidental luck. One weekend, while I was reorganizing my garage, something I do every spring, pulling everything out, going through boxes, deciding what to keep, I found a filing box that had been pushed to the back of a shelf. Inside it were documents from when I purchased the house. The full closing package, the title work, the survey, copies of the disclosures. And tucked behind the survey, slightly bent, was a document I had completely forgotten existed. I almost put it back without reading it. It was the kind of document that looks like routine paperwork at first glance. Dense text, formal language, a notary seal at the bottom. But something made me stop and actually read it. It was a declaration of non-incorporation. Specifically, it documented a formal legal determination, made at the county level, recorded in the public record, and tied directly to my parcel, that a specific portion of the property, including the corner of the lot where the fence sat, had been explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction at the time of an earlier subdivision plat amendment. The language was precise. The legal description matched my lot. The recording date was stamped clearly. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Then I took it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and made a cup of coffee. This document, if it said what I thought it said, meant that the HOA had never actually had jurisdiction over the section of the property where my fence stood. Not because of anything I had done or not done. Not because of the permits or the CC&Rs or any of the arguments I'd been making for the past year and a half. But because of something decided before I'd even owned the property. Something that was in the public record the whole time. The silence from Patricia had felt like relief. But what was actually coming, what I was now holding in my hands, was something else entirely. I did not immediately confront Patricia with the document. I'm the kind of person who prefers to understand something completely before acting on it, and I wanted to be sure I was reading it correctly. I made copies. I did some research on how declarations of non-incorporation work in my state. I reached back out to the HOA attorney I'd spoken with before, just to get a general read on what this type of document typically meant without going into the full specifics of my situation. What I was told, in general terms, was that such a document, if properly recorded and tied to a specific parcel, was significant, very significant. But before I could decide on my next step, Patricia made hers. I was on the back porch when I heard the truck. I walked around front and saw exactly what I described at the very start of this story. The flatbed, the skid steer loader, Patricia in my driveway with a clipboard and a folder, 2 workers in high-visibility vests standing near the truck, and a county sheriff's deputy pulling up to the curb. I took a breath. I went inside and retrieved my folder, the one containing the document I'd found, the survey, the permits, and every violation notice Patricia had ever sent me. Then I walked out to meet them. Patricia spoke first. She was composed, official-sounding, the version of herself she deployed when she wanted to appear reasonable. She told me that the HOA board had authorized removal of the fence as a hazardous structure, that the contractor was here to perform that work, and that she had notified law enforcement as a courtesy to ensure the process went smoothly. I looked at the deputy. He was a calm-looking man, probably in his mid-40s, with the practiced, neutral expression of someone who has seen a lot of neighbor disputes and has learned not to form opinions before hearing both sides. He introduced himself, Deputy Carver, from the county sheriff's office. He said he'd received a call from the HOA indicating there was a property matter that might require a peace officer's presence. He wasn't there to take sides, he said. He was there to make sure things stayed orderly. I thanked him for being there. I meant it. Patricia turned back to me and said, "Marcus, this doesn't have to be difficult. We've given you more than enough time to address the situation voluntarily." I said, "I have some questions about the legal basis for what you're proposing to do today, and I'd like to walk through them with Deputy Carver present." Patricia's expression flickered. Just briefly, I asked her to show me the court order authorizing entry onto my property for the purpose of demolishing a structure. She said that under the HOA's governing documents, the board had the authority to remediate hazardous structures without a court order. I asked Deputy Carver whether it was his understanding that an HOA board could legally enter private property and demolish a structure without a court order. The deputy said, carefully, that it was not his role to interpret contract law, but that as a general matter, an HOA's authority to enter private property and conduct physical removal of a structure was not something he could facilitate without documentation. He said if there was a court order, he'd be glad to see it. Patricia said there was no court order because none was required. The deputy said that in that case, his presence wasn't going to be very useful to her, and that he would suggest she speak with an attorney before proceeding. Patricia pivoted. She turned to the workers near the truck and started to say something about beginning preparations. And that was when I opened my folder. I said, "Patricia, before anyone touches anything, I need to show you and Deputy Carver something." I held up the Declaration of Non-Incorporation. I explained calmly what it was. I said that the document had been recorded with the county at the time of a subdivision plat amendment, and that it specifically addressed the parcel, my parcel, including the corner of the lot where the fence sat. I said that based on my reading of the document, the area in question had been formally excluded from HOA jurisdiction. Patricia stared at the document. For the first time in a year and a half, she didn't have a quick answer. One of the workers by the truck had quietly moved away from the equipment and was looking at his phone. The other was watching the exchange with an expression that suggested he was very much hoping not to be part of whatever this was becoming. Deputy Carver asked to see the document. I handed it to him. He read it, slowly, carefully, the way people read things when they understand that the details matter. He looked at the notary seal. He looked at the recording information at the top. Then he handed it back to me and looked at Patricia. He said, "Ma'am, I think you need to make some calls before anything happens here today. I want to stop for just a second because I still find it remarkable that it ever got this far. A demolition crew, a sheriff's deputy, all of it, over a perfectly legal, permitted, professionally built fence. Have you ever seen or experienced authorities being called over something that turned out to be this minor? Leave a comment below, because based on what I hear from people, this is more common than it should be." Patricia did not leave immediately. That's not how she operated. She was not someone who backed down easily, and even with a deputy standing in my driveway and an official-looking document in my hand, she regrouped. She said she had never seen that document before, and she doubted its authenticity. Deputy Carver said that the document appeared to have official county recording information on it, and that he couldn't speak to its contents, but that it was not something he could dismiss. Patricia said that the HOA's attorney had reviewed the property records and found no such limitation on the association's authority. I said, calmly, that the document had been recorded with the county and was part of the public record. I said that if the HOA's attorney had reviewed the property records and missed a recorded declaration, that might be something worth discussing with that attorney. Patricia's jaw tightened. She opened her folder and pulled out a packet of papers, what appeared to be a prepared summary of the HOA's position, probably assembled for exactly this kind of confrontation. She began walking Deputy Carver through it, point by point. The fence was over the approved height. The fence was not pre-approved by the Architectural Committee. The fence had been designated a hazardous structure by an inspector. I waited until she was done. Then I went through my folder. I showed Deputy Carver the county permit for the fence, including the issued date, the inspection sign-off, and the name of the licensed contractor. I showed him the land survey, with the property lines clearly marked, confirming that the fence sat entirely on my land. Then I turned to the CC&Rs. I had a printed copy with key sections highlighted. I showed the section that defined what required ARC pre-approval. Fences were not on the list. I showed the section on hazardous structures, which defined the term as applying to structures that posed an imminent physical danger and included language requiring the HOA to obtain written documentation from a licensed structural engineer before initiating remediation. I asked Patricia if she had that documentation from a licensed structural engineer. She said the inspector had observed the fence. I asked if the inspector was a licensed structural engineer. She said he was a contractor. I said that per the HOA's own governing documents, a contractor's opinion was not sufficient to trigger the hazardous structure provision. Patricia started to say something, and then she stopped. She looked down at her folder. She flipped through a few pages. The fluency she usually brought to these conversations, the practiced certainty, the tone of complete authority, was not there. Then I showed her the supplemental design guide. Specifically, page 1, the sentence I had highlighted. This document is advisory in nature and does not supersede the recorded CC&Rs or any applicable county regulations. I had brought a copy for her and a copy for the deputy. I placed them both on the hood of the deputy's patrol car. Patricia looked at her own document, the one she had sent me, and the highlighted sentence. Deputy Carver read it. He looked up. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Finally, I returned to the Declaration of Non-Incorporation. I had done enough research in the days after finding it to be able to explain it in plain terms. I walked through what it documented, when it had been recorded, and which parcel it covered. I showed the legal property description and compared it to the legal description on my deed. They matched. Patricia said, I would need to have our attorney review that. I said that sounded like a reasonable next step. I said I also thought it would be a reasonable next step to have the contractors and their equipment leave my property, since there was clearly no legal basis for proceeding today. Deputy Carver seconded that, in the careful, neutral way that officers do when they want to give someone a graceful exit. He suggested to Patricia that proceeding without consulting an attorney would expose the association to significant legal risk, and that he would not be in a position to assist with any physical removal given what had been presented today. The two workers by the truck had already started quietly preparing to leave. The driver climbed back into the cab. The engine started. Patricia stood in my driveway for another moment, looking at her clipboard, looking at the truck backing away, looking at me. Then she said, "This isn't over." She walked to her silver SUV and drove away. Deputy Carver watched her go, then turned to me. He asked if I was okay. I said I was. He said he'd be documenting the call, and that if the HOA attempted anything further without proper legal authorization, I should call it in immediately. I thanked him. He shook my hand and left. I stood in my driveway, in my house shoes, holding my folder, watching the flatbed truck disappear around the corner. And for the first time in a year and a half, I actually believed it was going to be okay. Patricia had said this isn't over, but it turned out she was wrong about that. Within a week of the driveway confrontation, I sent a formal letter to the full HOA board, all 5 members, outlining everything that had occurred. The letter was not heated or accusatory. It was factual. It documented the sequence of violation notices, the attempts to enforce rules that didn't exist in the governing documents, the designation of a sound and permitted structure as hazardous without the required structural engineer documentation, and the arrival of a demolition crew at my property without a court order or any legitimate legal basis. I attached copies of everything. The permits, the survey, the declaration, the supplemental design guide with its advisory in nature language circled in red, the violation notices, my responses to each one, the certified mail receipts. I also noted that I had retained the attorney for potential further action and asked the board to convene and review these matters formally. The response came faster than I expected. About 10 days later, I received a letter from the HOA board, signed by 4 of the 5 members. Not from Patricia, from the other 4. It acknowledged receipt of my correspondence and stated that the board had held a special meeting to review the matters I had raised. It did not admit wrongdoing in so many words, but its language was careful and deliberate. It stated that upon review of the relevant documentation, the board had determined that the fence as constructed did not constitute a violation of the recorded CC&Rs, and that all outstanding violation notices related to the fence were being formally rescinded. The hazardous structure designation was withdrawn. All accrued fines related to the fence, and there had been several months of weekly $75 assessments accumulating on the books, were waived in full. The letter also stated that the board was conducting an internal review of the HOA's violation and enforcement procedures, and that going forward, all enforcement actions would require full board approval rather than unilateral action by the board president. That last sentence was the most significant one. It didn't name Patricia directly, but it didn't need to. Everyone who read it would understand what it meant. I also heard, through Dale across the street and a couple of other neighbors I had become friendly with over the course of all this, that the HOA's attorney had confirmed, after actually reviewing the Declaration of Non-Incorporation, that it was exactly what I said it was. A valid, recorded legal document that limited HOA jurisdiction over that section of my parcel. The attorney apparently had some pointed things to say to Patricia about why that document hadn't been identified earlier in the process. Patricia remained on the board for a few more months, but she stepped back significantly from the day-to-day enforcement activities. The patrol drives became less frequent. The violation notices slowed to almost nothing across the whole neighborhood. A few people mentioned to me that the atmosphere had shifted, that there was less of that low-level tension that had settled over the community during her tenure. At the following annual HOA meeting, Patricia did not run for re-election. She was replaced by a retired schoolteacher named Gerald, who opened his first board meeting by saying that his priority was making sure the HOA served the community rather than the other way around. He got a standing ovation. The demolition crew never came back. The fence still stands today. It looks great. Here's the thing I keep thinking about. Patricia showed up that morning with a contractor, equipment, and a law enforcement escort, completely confident that she was going to win. She had a folder. She had a plan. She had probably done this before, or something like it, and it had worked. But she had never actually checked the public record carefully. She had never considered that the homeowner she was pushing around for a year and a half might have documentation she didn't know existed. Do you think she expected this outcome? Do you think she ever imagined that morning ending the way it did? I'd really like to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. In the weeks and months after that morning, I spent some time thinking about what had actually happened. Not just the events themselves, but the larger pattern underneath them. The fence was always a pretext. That's the conclusion I kept coming back to. The fence was the thing Patricia chose to make her stand on, but what she was really doing, what that whole escalating series of notices and threats was really about, was establishing authority, demonstrating, to me and to the neighborhood, that she was the one who decided what was acceptable, that the rules meant what she said they meant, and that her interpretation was the one that counted. That kind of authority works very well when people don't push back. And most people don't, not because they're weak, but because the cost of fighting feels higher than the cost of just going along. Modify the fence. Replace the mailbox. Remove the sign. It's easier. You get on with your life. But there's a cost to that compliance that doesn't always get accounted for. When you yield to unreasonable authority the first time, it signals that yielding is possible, that the pressure works. And pressure tends to increase, not decrease, once it's established as effective. I'm not suggesting everyone should turn every HOA dispute into a legal battle. That's not a realistic or sustainable way to live. But knowing your rights, keeping records, understanding the actual governing documents of your community, those things matter. They matter a lot. And in my case, what ultimately resolved the situation wasn't a confrontation or a lawsuit or a dramatic public scene. It was a piece of paper I almost threw away without reading. The neighborhood itself is genuinely nicer now. I don't mean that just in the sense that Patricia's enforcement campaign has wound down. I mean that there's a different feeling on the street. Neighbors wave more, stop to talk, seem less guarded when they're outside. I ran into one woman who'd been on the receiving end of multiple notices about her garden. A beautiful, carefully maintained garden, by the way, and she told me that she'd actually started replanting sections she'd removed under pressure. She was adding back the things she loved. It was good to see. I still wave when I see Patricia around the neighborhood. I'm not here to make anyone's life difficult, and I don't hold a personal grudge. What happened was a process that went wrong because one person confused authority with power and enforcement with control. But the process corrected itself. The system worked, more or less, when the right information came to light. That matters. So that's the story. A fence, a year and a half of violation notices, a demolition crew in my driveway on a Tuesday morning, and a document I almost tossed in the recycling bin that ended up changing everything. If there's a lesson here, I think it's this. The people who understand their rights and keep their documentation tend to fare better than the people who assume authority is always correct. Not always. Not in every case. But as a general principle, information is your best protection. Knowing what you own, knowing what the actual rules say, and keeping a record of how those rules are being applied, that's not paranoia. That's just being prepared. Patricia had a folder. I had a better one. And sometimes, that's all it takes. If you've made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you being here. Stories like this one resonate with a lot of people because a lot of people have been in situations like it, where someone with a clipboard and a title tried to tell them they had no recourse. You do have recourse. Start with the documentation. If this video was useful or entertaining or just satisfying in that particular way that HOA karma stories tend to be, go ahead and hit the like button. It helps more people find this channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, please consider it, because I have a lot more of these stories to tell. Every single one of them is real. Every single one of them has that moment where the balance shifts. And coming up next, I've got a story about a property line dispute that ended with the HOA having to pay for the landscaping they destroyed. I'll just leave it at that. But before I go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that overreached? A neighbor who decided the rules meant whatever they wanted them to mean? A situation where you had to dig up documents to prove what you already knew was true? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best material for this channel comes from what you share. The more specific, the better. Let's hear it.